Indian Hater vs. Warrior Nation, Jeff Turner's full story. South Texas, 1840. The night air remains thick with heat on the bank of Chickaletta Creek, northeast of Victoria. Jeff Turner, a large man with a wild, untrimmed beard and weathered skin, sits alone beside his small campfire. Despite the exhaustion evident in his broad shoulders, sleep refuses to come. His eyes never leave the flames as memories flood his mind. His strong hands grip the wooden handle of his hunting knife with such force that his knuckles turn white against the firelight. The knife shows signs of heavy use, nicks and stains that speak of violent encounters. His only companion in this sparse camp is his horse, Pepperpot, a temperamental black stallion that few men besides Turner can handle. Tonight, like every night for the past years, Turner's thoughts return to his old farmstead, situated 60 miles away along the banks of the Guadalupe River. He had arrived in Texas from Kentucky in the 1830s, leaving behind the familiar rolling hills and rich soil of the bluegrass state. Born and raised among Kentucky's farming communities, Turner had once believed he would spend his life working the land near his birthplace, just as his father had done. In those earlier days, Turner had married a young woman from his hometown near Beach Fork. Together they had built a small but prosperous farm that provided for their growing family. Their 3 young sons helped with the daily chores, learning the ways of farming as they grew. The family didn't have much, but they had enough. Then came the evening that would change everything. A traveler, dusty from the road, stopped at their farm asking for a meal and a place to sleep, a common occurrence in Kentucky's farming communities. The Turners welcomed him in, sharing their table and their home as was customary. Over bowls of hot food, the stranger spoke of his destination. His words painted pictures of Texas that would haunt Turner's thoughts for months to come. He described endless expanses of unclaimed land, soil richer than anything in Kentucky, hills teeming with deer and turkey, rivers where fish practically jumped into your hands. The stranger spoke of opportunities for anyone with the courage to seize them, of vast cattle ranges waiting to be claimed, of fortunes to be made by those willing to work hard and face the challenges of frontier life. The next morning, the traveler continued his journey south, but his words had taken root in Turner's mind. Though his family lived without immediate want, their existence was modest. The small Kentucky farm provided enough for daily needs, but Turner began to see the limitations of their situation. There would be little left to pass on to his sons, no wealth to ensure his wife's comfort in her later years. For months, Turner wrestled with these concerns, increasingly convinced that he was failing his family by not reaching for something more. When Turner finally decided they would sell the farm and move to Texas, his wife's reluctance was immediate and fierce. She understood the risks of abandoning their modest but reliable life in Kentucky. The prospect of starting over in an unknown territory terrified her. For months they debated the decision. Turner spoke of opportunities and dreams of wealth, while his wife reminded him of the dangers they had heard about. Texas, in the 1830s, existed in a state of violent transition. Though it was establishing itself as an independent republic, claiming vast territories from Matagorda Bay to what would become the Oklahoma Panhandle, the reality was far more complex. The land didn't truly belong to the Texians, nor had it belonged to the Mexican government before them, or the Spanish before that. For over a century, Texas had been the domain of the Comanche, and they defended it with terrifying efficiency. Even in Kentucky, settlers spoke in hushed tones about Comanche raids. The Kentucky settlers had their own history of conflict with native tribes, brutal wars with the Shawnee and Cherokee that had seen unspeakable violence on both sides. Generations of settlers had witnessed the slaughter of men, women, and children, both native and white. Yet the stories coming from Texas were different, marked by a level of violence that made even hardened frontiersmen pause. The Comanche had systematically destroyed anyone who challenged their control. Spanish missionaries, who attempted to establish missions, found them burned to the ground. Mexican settlers who tried to establish farms disappeared without a trace. Indigenous tribes like the Tonkawa, Waco, Delaware, Kickapoo, and Apache all fell before the Comanche's military might. When the Comanche raided, they left nothing behind. They killed all adult men and young children, taking only those they could use as slaves or adopt into their tribes. Entire villages vanished overnight, leaving only silence and the occasional survivor to tell the tale. Women captured by the Comanche faced a grim fate. They were forced into lives of slavery and concubinage, treated as disposable property. When they grew too old or weak to serve, or when their captors lost interest, they were killed without mercy. These stories of brutality spread throughout the territory, carried by the few survivors who managed to escape. Yet the horror stories didn't stem the tide of settlers pouring into Texas. Dreams of wealth and land ownership proved stronger than fear. Jeff Turner, like many before him, finally convinced his wife that their future lay in Texas. The prospect of reward outweighed the considerable risks. After lengthy discussions and careful planning, Turner sold their Kentucky farm, securing a decent profit that would fund their journey. The family packed everything they owned into wagons and began their long journey south to the Republic of Texas. Their journey took them first to San Antonio, where they spent several weeks gathering information about suitable land and learning about local conditions. From there, they followed the Guadalupe River's winding southeastern course toward the Gulf of Mexico. The river would eventually empty into the Gulf, but the Turners found their ideal spot long before that, a tributary located between what would later become the towns of Seguin and Gonzales. Turner and his two eldest sons immediately set to work establishing their homestead. They built a solid cabin using local timber, carefully selecting the strongest logs and ensuring the structure would withstand Texas weather. As spring arrived, they began the arduous task of clearing the surrounding brush and brambles, preparing the land for crops. Mrs. Turner, despite her initial reluctance to leave Kentucky, gradually warmed to their new home. The stranger's promises about Texas had proven true. The soil was indeed rich and dark, perfect for farming. Wild game was plentiful in the surrounding woods, ensuring her husband could keep their table well supplied with meat. The creek that ran near their cabin provided clean water and fish in abundance. Its steady flow created a pleasant backdrop to their daily lives. After enduring months of difficult travel and the challenges of establishing a new home, the family's bold decision seemed vindicated. The Turners had found their place in Texas, and happiness settled over their homestead. One morning in early May, Jeff Turner prepared for a hunting expedition. Before shouldering his rifle and heading out, he paused to take in the scene before him. His three sons, all under 10 years old, played near the stream that had become central to their new life. They were engaged in their favorite game, rolling wooden hoops with sticks. The hoops, crafted by tying the ends of slender branches together, stood waist-high to the boys. This simple game, shared by European, American, and indigenous children alike, brought pure joy to his sons' faces. Their laughter and shouts filled the morning air. At the side of the cabin, Mrs. Turner worked in their small but thriving vegetable garden. She moved between the rows of young plants, pruning and tending to each one with careful attention. As she worked, she sang her favorite songs in a clear, melodious voice that carried across the homestead. When Turner announced his departure, she offered a cheerful goodbye without missing a note of her song. Turner's heart swelled with contentment as he set out along the creek. He followed its course around a bend, finding himself in a moderate thicket barely a mile from home. The morning promised to be warm, but Turner didn't mind. Even if the hunt proved unsuccessful, he looked forward to exploring more of his new territory. The early morning silence was broken only by the gentle sound of flowing water. Then everything changed. The peaceful morning exploded with the sharp crack of multiple rifles firing in rapid succession, perhaps a dozen or more shots. Cold terror gripped Turner's heart as he processed the sound. His mind immediately conjured the worst possibilities as he turned and sprinted back toward his home. Seconds later, his fears were confirmed by the sounds that would haunt him forever, screams of terror and war cries mixing in the morning air. The morning air filled with a horrific mixture of sounds, triumphant Comanche war cries overlapping with the desperate screams of Turner's family. As he sprinted toward home, the family's screams gradually faded until only the war cries remained. When Turner finally rounded the bend and his cabin came into view, he confronted a scene of unimaginable horror. The attack had come from behind the house, but Turner approached from the front. Bursting through the door, he discovered the lifeless bodies of his wife and youngest son. His wife lay pale from blood loss, still clutching their youngest child in her arms. Even in death, she maintained her protective embrace, having used her body as a final shield for her son. Their blood had soaked into the wooden floor beneath them. Near the back door, Turner found his two older sons. Despite their young age, they had clearly tried to defend their home. Their bodies showed signs of desperate struggle. Multiple wounds, blood-soaked clothing, and fresh scalp wounds where the Comanche had claimed their gruesome trophies. They lay where they had fallen, having fought until their last breath. Just as Turner absorbed this devastating scene, he heard horses outside. The Comanche raiders had returned, dismounting and walking casually toward the cabin. They moved with the confidence of successful raiders, unaware that Turner had returned. In that moment, something broke inside Turner. Consumed by rage and grief, with no regard for his own life now that his family lay dead, he acted on pure instinct. Turner burst from the doorway, his loaded hunting rifle already at his shoulder. His first shot struck true, sending a lead ball through the heart of the nearest Comanche warrior, killing him instantly. Without pausing, Turner dropped his rifle and drew his large hunting knife from his belt. In his own later recounting, he said he rushed upon the balance like a tiger. The Comanche warriors, caught completely off guard by Turner's sudden appearance and the death of their companion, fell into momentary confusion. Turner seized this advantage, striking with savage efficiency. His knife found its mark multiple times as the warriors scrambled back toward their horses. In his rage-fueled attack, he managed to inflict fatal wounds on several raiders before they could mount an effective defense. The next few minutes passed in what Turner would later describe as a blur of violence. He attacked like a man possessed, slashing and stabbing at any warrior within reach, paying no attention to his own safety. His rampage ended only when several Comanche rifles fired in unison, their bullets finally bringing him down. Turner collapsed in the dirt yards from his dead family, his blood joining theirs in the Texas soil. The remaining Comanche warriors, unsure if more settlers might return, quickly gathered what supplies and trophies they could carry before disappearing into the rolling hills and elm thickets that dotted the landscape. Turner lay unconscious in his cabin, occasionally surfacing to consciousness only to confront the horror surrounding him. Later that afternoon, a neighbor noticed the unusual silence at the Turner farm. The typical sounds of an active family, 3 energetic boys, hard-working parents, daily farm work, were absent. Concerned, the neighbor investigated and discovered the gruesome aftermath of the morning's violence. Turner's well-ordered homestead had become a scene of carnage. The family members' bodies where they had fallen, and several mutilated Comanche corpses, adding to the devastating tableau. According to the neighbor's later account, he found Turner lying across the body of one of his Comanche attackers, one hand locked around the warrior's throat in a death grip. His other hand still clutched his hunting knife, which he had driven between the warrior's ribs all the way to the handle. The blade remained buried deep in his enemy's chest, testament to the force of Turner's final attack. The neighbor discovered 3 more Comanche warriors sprawled nearby, each bearing massive wounds from Turner's knife. Their bodies showed the savage effectiveness of Turner's desperate attack. Despite the horrific scene surrounding him, the neighbor noticed Turner still drew shallow breaths. With considerable effort, he managed to drag Turner's bloody form from the cabin and lift him onto his horse. He transported the gravelly wounded man to his own homestead, where his family and other neighbors helped tend to Turner's injuries. Multiple gunshot wounds and severe blood loss led most to believe Turner would soon die, yet Turner's body refused to surrender. For weeks, he lay in a fever-racked state, his wounded body racked with constant pain. He drifted between consciousness and delirium, reliving the massacre in his fever dreams. Through careful nursing and remarkable resilience, Turner's body eventually healed. His mind, however, remained fractured by trauma. He found himself unable to maintain normal social interactions. Simple conversations with those who hadn't witnessed his loss became unbearable ordeals. The weight of his memories proved too heavy to carry among ordinary people. Turner retreated into the wilderness of central Texas, abandoning civilization entirely. He forsook all thoughts of rebuilding a family or returning to farming. Instead, he devoted himself to a single purpose: hunting Comanche. His mission of revenge consumed every aspect of his existence. For years, Turner tracked Comanche parties through their own territories, learning their movements and habits. He launched a relentless one-man war against them, developing brutal expertise in tracking and killing. His reputation spread among both settlers and Comanche. The settlers viewed him with a complex mixture of gratitude and unease, thankful for his protection, but disturbed by his single-minded bloodlust. Even those who benefited from his actions recognized in Turner a man driven beyond the bounds of normal human behavior. Despite his growing notoriety as a fearsome Indian fighter, Turner remained tormented by his past. Each night since regaining consciousness after the massacre, he wrestled with the same question that haunted him now at his camp on Chickalate Creek: whether to face his memories awake or confront them in nightmares. Years of vengeance had brought him no closer to peace. The following day, Turner reluctantly headed toward a nearby settlement to replenish his supplies. He approached these necessary trips with dread, knowing they would force him into unwanted human contact. However, this particular day found the settlement in an unusual state of excitement. A group of Texas Rangers had just arrived on foot, a sight that immediately drew attention. The Rangers, though still a relatively new force, had already earned a reputation as a formidable military and law enforcement unit. Their current situation, however, was less than impressive. That morning, Comanche raiders had stolen all their horses, forcing them to walk into town. The Rangers arrived angry and embarrassed, immediately seeking replacement mounts. Fortune favored them, as a local rancher had recently brought in a fresh remuda of horses. Understanding the Rangers' urgent need, he offered them their choice of mounts to pursue the Comanche raiders. The young Rangers spent 15 minutes carefully approaching and saddling the half-broken horses, their collective pride demanding immediate pursuit of the thieves. Among these Rangers was William Alexander Anderson Wallace, a 23-year-old recruit who would later become the legendary Bigfoot Wallace. Though he would eventually build a formidable reputation as a Texas Ranger, at this moment he was inexperienced in Comanche warfare. His future acclaim in Texas history lay ahead of him, but on this day he was simply a young man eager to prove himself in his first real combat situation. Though Wallace led the Rangers' pursuit, his inexperience showed in his cautious movements and uncertain decisions. The dangers of tracking Comanche raiders weighed heavily on his mind as he attempted to follow their trail. His concentration broke when the Rangers heard horse hooves approaching from behind. The young Rangers instantly prepared for combat, hands moving to their weapons. Then, just as quickly, they relaxed their guard as a lone rider emerged, a man in his late 30s, dressed in buckskin shirt and leggings that showed months, if not years, of continuous wear. A worn coonskin cap sat atop his head. His weapons marked him as a seasoned frontiersman, an old Kentucky rifle and a single-shot pistol. He rode a large, nervous horse. The man's belt carried a tomahawk honed to surgical sharpness and a knife with rust-colored stains of dried blood on the handle. Most striking of all were his eyes. Wallace would later describe them in his biography. "I have seen eyes of all sorts, of panthers, wolves, catamounts, leopards, and Mexican lions, but I never saw eyes that glittered and flashed and danced about like those in that man's head." The man introduced himself as Jeff Turner and proceeded to share his tragic history, the murder of his wife and 3 sons by Comanche raiders 10 years earlier. This personal tragedy had transformed him into a man with a single purpose: killing Comanche warriors. Turner now lived a solitary existence in a camp north of Victoria, Texas. His tent bore the gruesome trophies of his vendetta: 42 Comanche scalps. He spoke openly of his ambition to increase this number to 100. Recognizing the Rangers' inexperience in tracking and fighting the Comanche, Turner offered his assistance. "I know every water and hole between here and the Rio Grande, and I will go any way these Indians go. You and your company may get tired and quit this trail without overtaking the Indians, but I shall stick to it until I get a scalp or two to take back with me to my camp." The events leading to this unlikely partnership had begun the previous evening near the Zumwalt settlement. The ranger company, about 12 men strong, had made a critical error born of inexperience. After a long day patrolling for Comanche raiders, they had camped near the settlement, believing its proximity offered protection. They had eaten well and settled in for what they expected to be a peaceful night's rest before riding into town the next morning. Their confidence proved costly. Breaking one of the frontier's most basic rules, they had failed to secure their horses properly. When dawn broke, they discovered their mounts gone, stolen by the very raiders they had been hunting. The young rangers were forced to walk several miles to Zumwalt settlement, carrying their saddles on their shoulders. A local rancher had provided them with fresh horses, but the incident highlighted their inexperience. If the Comanche raiders had managed to approach closely enough to steal their horses, they could just as easily have killed the entire ranger company in their sleep. The Comanche had spent the last 150 years conquering vast sections of Texas through ruthless warfare. They had earned their reputation through decades of successful raids against Mexican settlers and Anglo-Texans alike, killing, kidnapping, and stealing with impunity. Their mastery of mounted warfare and intimate knowledge of the territory made them formidable opponents for even experienced fighters, and devastatingly lethal to overconfident novices like these young rangers. The Comanche originated as a branch of the Shoshone tribe, surviving as hunter-gatherers in the harsh environment of the northern Rocky Mountains. Other tribes regularly victimized and dominated them until the horse transformed their destiny. In the 17th century, their first encounter with horses marked the beginning of a dramatic transformation that would reshape the American frontier. The Spanish, who first brought horses to the New World, carefully guarded their horses and the knowledge of breeding, training, and maintaining them. Their monopoly on horses, however, crumbled during the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. This uprising saw the Puebloan people violently reject Spanish and Catholic authority. Thousands of horses escaped or were captured. These animals spread across the northern New Mexico plains, fundamentally changing the power dynamics of the region. The Comanche quickly learned not just riding and hunting from horseback, but developed sophisticated techniques for mounted warfare. Their expertise extended to selective breeding, producing horses specifically suited for their needs. This mastery of horse culture transformed the Comanche from a marginalized tribe into a dominant military force. The Comanches' fight to control the richest buffalo hunting grounds, stretching from modern-day Kansas to Texas, demonstrated their new military prowess. The territory had originally belonged to the Apache, but the Comanche systematically drove them out. Their superior mobility and fighting techniques allowed them to overwhelm and displace the Apache. By the 1840s, the Comanche dominated nearly all of the southern plains. The Comanche viewed their territory as hard-won, and they particularly resented Texian intrusion. The Comanche responded to these incursions with brutal efficiency. This group of young rangers knew these stories intimately. Many had joined the Rangers specifically to avenge the Comanche raids on Texas settlements. Yet now, facing actual combat with the Comanche, the reality of their situation began to sink in. Their leader, William Alexander Anderson Wallace, carried an additional burden. At just 23 years old, he was an inexperienced commander who had already failed to protect his company's horses from theft. The embarrassment of this basic error weighed heavily on the young man. The Rangers spent the remainder of the morning following Turner's lead, watching as he read signs invisible to their untrained eyes. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly as they rode in concentrated silence, their eyes scanning the ground for traces of the raiding party. We soon discovered that he knew more about following a trail than all of us put together, and from this time on we let him take the lead, and followed him wherever he went. Throughout the long afternoon, the Rangers followed Turner as he led them across the unforgiving terrain. They watched in awe as he deciphered the subtle signs left by the Comanche raiding party, a broken twig here, a scuffed patch of earth there, clues invisible to their untrained eyes. With each passing hour, their initial apprehension towards the grizzled frontiersman gave way to grudging respect. They had judged him by his wild appearance and unsettling intensity, but now they witnessed his unmatched skill as a tracker and his intimate knowledge of the land. He was no mere vagrant, but a seasoned hunter, a man forged in the crucible of the frontier. As dusk approached, Turner suddenly reined in his horse. The rangers, who had spent hours studying his every movement, quickly gathered behind him, understanding the significance of his abrupt halt. Turner turned to address the inexperienced men, warning them to watch for Comanche sentries and maintain absolute silence. The young rangers, who had initially dismissed Turner as a deranged vagrant, now hung on his every word. The group advanced cautiously through the gathering darkness, alert for any sign of their quarry. After covering about 300 yards, they spotted the Comanche camp a quarter-mile to their right. Turner assessed the situation quickly. With daylight failing, they needed to strike immediately or lose their advantage. Without time for detailed planning or second thoughts, the Rangers faced their first real combat. The attack began with a thunderous charge, Turner leading the way toward the Comanche camp. The warriors had settled in for the evening, making a cold camp to avoid detection, but spotted the approaching force when they closed to within 50 yards. Despite the surprise, the Comanche warriors reacted with practiced efficiency, snatching up their weapons and launching a volley of arrows and bullets at the charging attackers. The Rangers dismounted and returned fire, with Turner taking point. Wallace's account captures the chaos of those first moments. Just as I sprang from the saddle to the ground, a big Indian stepped from behind a post oak tree and drew an arrow upon me that looked to me as long as a barber's pole. I jumped behind another tree, as spry as a city clerk in a dry goods store when a parcel of women come around shopping. Wallace's quick reaction saved his life. The arrow screamed past his head, taking a strip of bark from his cover. Terror replaced his earlier bravado as he attempted to return fire, but his shaking hands betrayed him. His shot went wide, missing the Comanche warrior completely. The battle descended into 20 minutes of intense close-quarters fighting. The thick brush and failing light made the combat especially chaotic and personal. While the young Rangers struggled to maintain their composure in their first firefight, Turner operated on a different level entirely. He moved through the battlefield with methodical precision, seemingly unconscious of the chaos around him. His wild eyes reflected both bloodlust and strange joy as he loaded, fired, and advanced. Wallace observed Turner throughout the fight, later recording, "I noticed my friend Jeff several times during the fight, and each time he was engaged in lifting the hair from the head of an Indian that either he or someone else had shot." Wallace's account captured Turner's mechanical efficiency in combat. They say that practice makes perfect, and it was astonishing to see how quickly Jeff would take off an Indian's scalp and load his rifle in readiness for another. One slash from his butcher knife in a sudden jerk, and the bloody scalp was soon dangling from his belt. Despite the speed of his actions, Turner maintained an unsettling composure. At the same time, he never seemed to be in a hurry, but was as cool and deliberate about everything he did as a carpenter when he is working by the day and not by the job. The battle's climax demonstrated Turner's lethal precision. As the Comanche began retreating, one warrior attempted to escape on one of the Rangers' stolen horses. In his panic, the warrior forgot to untie the horse from a post oak tree. Wallace described the grim scene that followed. Round and round the tree he went until he wound himself up to the body when, just at that instant, Jeff plugged him with a half-ounce bullet and had his scalp off before he was done kicking. As darkness settled over the battlefield, the surviving Comanche disappeared into the vast Texas wilderness. The Rangers, still wary of another attack, formed a defensive circle and frantically reloaded their weapons. Their caution proved warranted when a final war cry split the air, followed immediately by a gunshot. A tall, thin Ranger collapsed, clutching his face and crying out, "Boys, I am a dead man!" While Turner continued his pursuit of fleeing warriors, the other Rangers spotted the source of the shot. a mortally wounded Comanche warrior lying in the grass 30 yards away. Wallace recognized him as one he'd seen fall earlier in the fight and assumed dead. In a final act of defiance, the warrior had raised himself up for one last shot before collapsing back, his weapon still gripped tightly in death. Later examination revealed he had sustained 7 bullet wounds before finally succumbing. Before anyone could investigate further, Turner materialized from the shadows, his clothes and hands covered in blood. With practiced efficiency, he took the warrior's scalp, punched a hole through it, and added it to his growing collection on his belt. The Rangers noticed something unusual. A fleeting expression of serenity crossed Turner's typically tormented face as he performed this grim ritual. The Rangers' fears for their wounded comrade proved unnecessary. The bullet had only grazed his head, leaving him shaken but largely unharmed. After recovering most of their stolen horses, the group finally allowed themselves to relax around a campfire and share a hot meal. Turner joined them, his bloody work completed. As the exhausted Rangers recounted the day's events, the tension gradually lifted. One young Ranger sheepishly admitted to repeatedly shooting at a tree stump, having mistaken it for a charging warrior in the heat of battle. The story drew laughter from the group, and to everyone's surprise, Turner joined in. His unexpected burst of genuine laughter startled both the Rangers and Turner himself. Wallace would later note the significance of this moment. Either the unusual sound of his own laugh frightened him, or else he had used up all his stock on hand, for I never saw him crack a smile afterwards. The brief glimpse of humanity vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Turner's expression darkened once again, his face resuming its haunted cast, as the weight of his past seemed to resettle on his shoulders. Turner's momentary connection with the Rangers evaporated as his eyes grew distant once again, his mind clearly wandering back to the tragic memories that haunted him day and night. After their brief respite and hasty meal, the Rangers prepared for their return journey to the Zumwalt settlement. Upon reaching their destination, Turner departed without ceremony or extended farewell, the fresh scalps from their recent battle still dangling grotesquely from his belt, testament to his deadly profession. Wallace's later accounts would reveal Turner's continued presence in the region. I was told when I was at that settlement several years after this that he had stayed around there for a good while, occasionally coming into the settlement for his supplies of ammunition, etc., and always bringing with him 4 or 5 scalps. Each appearance of Turner in the settlement served as a grim reminder of his relentless mission of vengeance. While Turner continued his solitary war against the Comanche, Wallace pursued his own path to legend, serving with distinction in the Texas Rangers until his death at the age of 82 in 1899. Though Wallace's published memoirs claimed no knowledge of Turner's ultimate fate, the truth of the matter lay buried in private conversations, only to surface decades later through an unexpected chain of historical inquiry. The revelation would come to light in El Paso, Texas, on a cold December evening in 1932, in a hotel room where renowned Texas historian J. Frank Dobie anxiously awaited a crucial interview. Dobie had spent the afternoon in meticulous preparation, reviewing his extensive collection of notes and historical documents. His restless movements and frequent glances at the door betrayed his anticipation of meeting a man whose knowledge might finally help him unravel one of Texas history's most persistent mysteries. As early evening settled over El Paso, bringing with it a penetrating winter chill, a knock at his door announced the arrival of the man he'd waited so long to meet. Frank Collinson stood in the doorway, his imposing physical presence matched by an unexpectedly refined manner that spoke to his unique background. Born in England and transported by circumstance to the Texas frontier in 1872 at the tender age of 17, Collinson had carved out an extraordinary existence in his adopted home. For decades, he had lived the harsh, solitary life of a working cowboy, facing the daily dangers and hardships of the Texas frontier. Yet beneath his weather-worn exterior lay the mind of a scholar, a man who had maintained his intellectual pursuits despite the demanding physical nature of his chosen profession. Unlike many of his contemporaries on the frontier, Collinson had cultivated a deep appreciation for philosophy, science, and literature throughout his years of cowboy work. This combination of practical frontier experience and scholarly inclination made him an invaluable resource for historians like Dobie, seeking to bridge the gap between academic research and lived experience. Dobie welcomed the elderly cowboy into his room, offering escape from the December cold. Though already established as a preeminent authority on Texas and Southwest history, Dobie had sought out Collinson, hoping to fill crucial gaps in his research that years of academic investigation had failed to resolve. Collinson, well aware of Dobie's scholarly reputation, wasted no time on small talk, steering their conversation directly toward matters of historical significance. "Did you ever have the chance to meet Bigfoot Wallace?" Collinson asked, referencing the legendary Texas Ranger whose exploits had become cornerstone of frontier lore. "No, regrettably, I never had that opportunity," Dobie replied, "though I'm well versed in his exploits and their significance to Texas history." Collinson leaned forward in his chair, his expression growing serious as the lamplight cast deep shadows across his weathered features. His next question carried a weight that immediately captured Dobie's attention. "Did you ever hear of Jeff Turner, the Indian hater?" Dobie felt himself being subjected to an impromptu test of his historical knowledge. "Yes, I've read about him in Duvall's book on Bigfoot Wallace," he replied, referring to the 1871 publication of The Adventures of Bigfoot Wallace by John C. Duvall. His answer seemed to satisfy Collinson, whose face reflected both a knowing smile and a touch of sorrow as memories of Texas's violent past surfaced in his mind. "Does the book tell what became of Jeff Turner?" Collinson asked, his voice carrying a hint of someone who already knew the answer but wished to confirm the extent of published history. "No," Dobie replied, unconsciously shifting to the edge of his seat in anticipation. "I've often wondered about his ultimate fate. It's one of the mysteries I've never been able to resolve through my research." "Well, Bigfoot told me," Collinson said simply, his words carrying the weight of long-held secret history. Then, as Dobie leaned forward fully engaged, Collinson began to reveal the true story of what had happened to the notorious Indian hunter, a tale that had remained hidden from historical record for decades. Collinson began by recounting the story that had set Turner on his path of vengeance. In the 1830s, Turner had brought his family to Texas, settling along the Guadalupe River. Their peaceful life ended brutally when Comanche raiders attacked while Turner was hunting. He returned to find his wife and 3 sons murdered, and though the Comanche tried to kill him too, Turner survived despite severe wounds. After recovering under his neighbor's care, he established a solitary camp on Chickaloth Creek and dedicated his life to hunting Comanche warriors. This mission led to his fateful meeting with Wallace and the Rangers in 1840, where he proved himself an expert tracker and fearsome fighter. The story of Turner's family tragedy and his transformation into the notorious Indian hater had deeply affected Wallace, who shared these details with Collinson years later. Now, Collinson was ready to reveal what Wallace had told him about Turner's ultimate fate. After Wallace and his Rangers departed the Zumwalt settlement, the true story of Turner's end remained untold for decades. Wallace had shared 2 possible accounts with Collinson, both deemed too brutal for inclusion in Duvall's published narrative, which catered to Victorian sensibilities. The first account described Turner's final capture by the Comanche, who found him sleeping in a remote camp in South Texas. Throughout Comanche territory, Turner had earned a fearsome reputation as the savage white man who had taken countless scalps from their people. Yet the Comanche acknowledged his warrior spirit, seeing in him something that transcended mere vengeance. The Comanche's spiritual beliefs centered not on a single deity, but on a universal power called Puha, which they believed existed in all natural elements, from the smallest rock to the mightiest buffalo. In Turner, they recognized a heart of exceptional power, making him valuable for their sacred rituals. This same quality that had made him their deadliest enemy would now serve their spiritual purposes. The Comanche dragged their prized captive to the camp of a prominent chief, treating him with calculated cruelty that exceeded their usual handling of prisoners. By the time they reached the chief's lodge in the early morning, Turner was already battered from the journey. The Texas sun bore down mercilessly as they positioned him before the chief's teepee. The lodge's entrance flap swept aside, revealing the chief, a commanding middle-aged man whose face bore the weathering of years and barely contained fury. He studied Turner intently, examining the features of this hated Taibo, the Comanche term for whites, who had caused such devastation among his people. The warriors surrounding them jeered and taunted their captive, waiting for their chief's signal. At the chief's command, the warriors threw Turner to the ground, subjecting him to a fresh barrage of clubs and fists. 4 warriors untied his bindings only to secure each limb to wooden stakes driven deep into the hard Texas soil. Throughout this ordeal, Turner remained eerily silent, his eyes wide and alert, even as the assembled villagers hurled abuse and warriors continued to strike him. A sudden hush fell over the gathered crowd as the chief returned to his lodge. He emerged moments later with his wife, a woman of natural grace and dignity despite her advanced pregnancy. She was younger than the chief, but carried herself with the authority of her position. The chief's wife approached the bound captive, her body elaborately adorned with ceremonial paint and feathers that marked her status. Where her husband's face contorted with hatred, hers maintained a mask of ritual indifference. 2 female attendants carefully guided her forward, helping her settle on a prepared seat barely a yard from Turner. His breathing became increasingly rapid as the brutal ceremony approached its climax beneath the climbing Texas sun. The chief stepped forward, brandishing a massive hunting knife designed for butchering buffalo. For several agonizing minutes, he tormented Turner with the blade, bringing it close to his face, making mock strikes that stopped just short of cutting flesh. The assembled crowd watched in tense silence as their chief prolonged the infamous scalp hunter's final moments. When the actual execution began, it was performed with calculated cruelty. Turner was dismembered by the chief's practiced hand. His heart, believed to contain powerful warrior medicine, was carefully removed and presented to the chief's wife. She consumed it in the traditional manner, believing this would imbue her unborn child with Turner's fierce fighting spirit. His remains were discarded without ceremony, and the man who had terrorized the Comanche for years was never seen again at the Zumwalt settlement. But Collinson revealed that Wallace had shared a second, equally grim account of Turner's demise. In this version, Turner had found a kindred spirit in another frontiersman known as Smoky, who matched Turner's dedication to collecting Comanche scalps. During one of their patrols through the Texas Hill Country, they encountered a family under attack by Comanche raiders. Without hesitation, Turner and Smoky intervened, their accurate shots dropping 2 warriors and successfully drawing the raiders' attention away from their intended victims. The enraged war party abandoned their original target to pursue Turner and Smoky, chasing them into what proved to be a fatal trap, a box canyon, with sheer rock walls offering no escape except the way they had entered. As darkness approached, the pair discovered a small cave entrance, barely wide enough to admit a man's body. With no other options, they squeezed through the narrow opening one after another, entering complete darkness. Several yards in, the passage widened just enough to allow them to move in a crouched position. Turner led the way as they inched forward at an agonizingly slow pace, hoping to find either another exit or a defensible position. The silence of their retreat was suddenly broken by the unmistakable warning sound of a rattlesnake. Both men froze instantly. Turner, prepared for various emergencies, had a book of Mexican wax matches in his pocket. With trembling fingers, he extracted one and struck it against the cave wall. The small flame illuminated a scene straight from a nightmare. No more than 10 feet ahead, a massive tangle of diamondback rattlesnakes covered the cave floor. Some of the serpents moved menacingly toward the light, while others slithered deeper into the darkness. The men remained perfectly still, knowing any movement could trigger a deadly strike. Long minutes passed in terrifying stillness, each man hardly daring to breathe as they watched the snakes. Then disaster struck. Turner's leg seized with a sudden cramp, forcing him to shift his weight ever so slightly. This tiny movement, barely perceptible in the darkness, was enough to provoke one of the agitated diamondbacks. The snake struck with lethal accuracy, its fangs finding their mark in Turner's flesh. "Smoky," Turner whispered, his voice already showing the effects of the venom. "I've lifted my last scalp." With Comanche warriors guarding the cave's entrance, escape was impossible. Smoky could only watch helplessly as his friend succumbed to the snake's poison. Turner's body began to contort violently within the confined space, his movements restricted by the cave's narrow walls. As the venom worked through his system, his mind began to wander into hallucinations. In his final moments, Turner clutched Smoky's arm, his eyes wild with delirium. "Look," he whispered in panic. "There's a hole in the ground right in front of me. It's the skylight to hell, and I wonder why the devil left it uncovered." Frank J. Dobie's account, Between the Comanche and the Rattlesnake, describes how Turner's last words painted vivid pictures of his descent into hellfire as the venom coursed through his veins. By dawn, Turner lay dead in the cave. The rattlesnakes had retreated deeper into their den, and the Comanche warriors had abandoned their watch. Smoky carried out his final duty to his friend, burying Turner's body in a simple grave near Fort Phantom Hill in what would later become Abilene, Texas. The true manner of Jeff Turner's death remains uncertain, but his final moments matched his life, violent, brutal, and driven by forces beyond his control. His story, though extraordinary, represents just one thread in the complex tapestry of Texas history. The brutal conflicts between Comanche, Texan, Mexican, Apache, Tonkawa, Karankawa, Kiowa, and Spanish peoples shaped this land through countless untold stories of violence and revenge. Thank you for watching Native Legends and History Stories. If you enjoyed this episode about Jeff Turner and the Comanche, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from America's fascinating past. We'll see you in our next video.